Before I turn it over to Ted Alden, just a quick question. This is a political question. So President-elect Biden has promised to focus on the middle class, and he built a blue wall in part to, appeal to voters who, have been hurt economically, both before the pandemic and after the pandemic. But Mary Lovely's data says that, Trump's policies have cost $1,600 per worker in the affected areas and 200,000 jobs. Whether or not the American public believes those statistics, we're going to leave that question aside. But as you give us the way forward, Ted, could you talk about, how a President-elect Biden needs to go about kind of winning back the workers that he did not carry, many of whom are non-college educated, who did not vote for him, but in fact are the intended targets of his trade policies? Over to you with that easy question.
Thanks very much, Sunny. If I knew the answer to that, he'd probably hire me. Anyway, look, it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Great to be here with Mary Ann Lingling. What I'm going to try to do here is just take Mary's excellent overview and distill it into some stories that journalists should be watching in 2021. I will mostly not talk about the U.S. and China because Lingling is our expert on that. And I'm going to let her talk more about that. So U.S. trade policy in 2021, 6 stories to watch. So Mary mentioned this in her overview. One of the most dramatic things that we have seen in the past several years, and it's still TBD exactly how dramatic it will turn out to be, but we are seeing a reorganization of global supply chains. U.S.-China conflict has had a lot to do with that, particularly in high technology sectors. President-elect Biden, if you look at his quite detailed campaign promises on this issue, has promised to implement what he calls fundamental reforms that shift production of a whole range of products back to U.S. soil. So he's talking about a reshoring of significant chunks of manufacturing that have moved overseas, a lot of it to Asia. The sectors that are targeted make sense for people paying attention to what's going on with the pandemic, but he's not just talking about medical equipment and PPE and critical medical supplies, but also looking at technologies like energy and grid resilience, semiconductors. U.S. is still very dependent on fabrication in Taiwan in particular, key electronics technologies, telecommunications infrastructure for anybody who's been following the issues between the United States and Huawei, and key raw materials like rare earths, which are so critical for high technology applications. This is going to be a story that will have many dimensions, in the coming year and beyond. Questions about which industries are the winners and losers in this reshuffling of supply chains. What are the costs for taxpayers? There are bills that have been thrown around in Congress that talk about spending $25 billion of taxpayer money to encourage reshoring of semiconductor production, for example. So there are going to be real issues here about taxpayer-supported subsidies to try to encourage this reshoring. So, if I were going to go report these stories, you can do it a lot of different ways. You can guarantee that state and local economic development officials across the country are going to be looking into this. What are the industries that we might be able to attract to our cities and states? Every city, every state has these economic development officials. Supply chain managers at your local companies. I've had a lot of conversations over the last year with supply chain officials from multinationals thinking about how vulnerable are we in China? What if there's an escalation in U.S.-China tension? Do we have a plan B and a plan C? Think tanks and universities. I've got supply chain experts in think tanks. I actually think the universities are a better bet here. If you look at business schools, they all have supply chain experts paying attention to this. Commerce Department has got officials working on this, and then I'll talk a little more about this subsequently, but trade associations are a great resource for journalists, not just the big comprehensive ones like the National Association of Manufacturers and the Chamber of Commerce, but every specific industry, Semiconductor Industry Association, for example, has trade associations in Washington focused on these issues. So those are great folks to talk to for these stories. A second story, tariffs and more, possibly fewer tariffs. Mary outlined this extremely well in terms of the departure we've seen under the Trump administration. The WTO was supposed to mean that countries didn't unilaterally impose tariffs on each other anymore. They only did so following decisions by dispute panels in the WTO. Now we see, led by the United States, but other countries doing this as well, imposing tariffs unilaterally. Biden has not said how quickly he's going to move on this tariff issue, whether he's going to move to lift some of the tariffs on China or the steel and aluminum tariffs on Europe. But there will be stories right out of the block with companies that have been harmed by the tariffs pressing the administration to either remove them, or there's a whole special procedure in which companies can apply for exemptions from the tariffs that the Trump administration has used quite conservatively. A Biden administration may be more generous on that front. It's a whole list of sectors there that have been affected by tariffs. Again, depending on where you're reporting from, there are probably some of these industries in your jurisdiction. So again, this is very much a win-lose kind of story. What kind of pressure is Biden going to face to lift the tariffs? Ling Ling can talk about how the Chinese might respond to this, and which companies, sectors, and regions are going to win and lose in this. Again, trade associations, local officials from affected companies, trade lawyers are a great resource for any story having to do with tariffs. I mean, companies that are applying, for instance, for exemptions from the tariffs in Washington are hiring trade lawyers, most of them based in DC, but sometimes in other places, who are putting together their claims for the US government. So getting to know the trade lawyers who are working for companies that you're concerned about is a great resource. Academic economists like Mary at the Peterson Institute are great. I think, my think tank, Jennifer Hillman, is fabulous on this stuff. CSIS has got Bill Reinsch and other people there. Brookings has got some great people. Again, state and local economic development officials paying attention to this, because the tariffs are either helping or hurting their industry. Actually, one I should have included under here as well is labor union officials, because they often, again, have a big stake in what happens to companies where their workers are employed. Third story I would keep an eye on, the U.S. place in the Asia-Pacific trading order. I think, again, putting U.S.-China bilateral to the side right for the moment, the question of the U.S. place in Asia, I think, is the big international economic question for the next decade and beyond. As Mary suggested, President-elect Biden has said he's not going to go out immediately looking for new trade agreements in Asia or anywhere else. He's said quite explicitly he's not going to pursue further trade deals until we've made major investments here at home in our workers and our communities. That would seem to make impossible any quick U.S. effort to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership that President Trump pulled out of on his first day in office. U.S. allies in Asia want the United States back in the TPP. I think I get a call every week from a reporter in New Zealand asking me what are the prospects for the U.S. rejoining the TPP. There's a lot of concern in that region. And Mary mentioned the recent conclusion of the RCEP, which involves China and Japan and South Korea and the ASEAN countries. And so China is building a trade architecture in Asia. So there's a real question about what is the U.S. place going to be in this, the most dynamic region in the world. There was a great piece in Bloomberg magazine this month on how Asia is returning to its position at the center of the global economy. The question is how the U.S. will engage. This is politically very complicated for the Biden administration. So there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party who are not particularly enthusiastic about TPP or an active trade agenda in Asia. And it's, remains to be seen how the Republicans are going to respond to a Democratic president on this issue. They are willing to go along with President Trump, but may not be with the President Biden. Here, your sources go outside the sort of trade world. If you've got Washington correspondents, obviously looking for contacts at the State Department and the White House and other places. I found when I was reporting that embassy representatives are fabulous here. The representatives in Washington for all of the Asian countries are very plugged into what's going on in DC, very obviously aware of their own country's interests. If you can build relations there, that's incredibly valuable. Academic and think tank experts, again, useful here. And there's some good ones, specifically dealing with Asia, the Asia Society, where Wendy Cutler is now the vice president. She was the lead negotiator for the TPP. It's fabulous. Sunny didn't pay me to add this, but the Heinrich Foundation, my friend Steve Olson works for them out of Thailand. He's a great analyst of the region. He's got a new piece just out on the RCEP. And the Lowy Institute in Australia, Richard McGregor, who was a colleague of mine at the Financial Times, is one of the world's leading experts on China. And a final resource I'd suggest: look at congressional staff on key committees. House Foreign Affairs, Senate Foreign Relations. Congressional staff are often very up on the latest and sometimes freer to talk than administration officials. Number 4, can the WTO survive? Mary really gave a good overview here. I mean, I was, one of the highlights of my reporting career was being in Geneva for the final negotiations of the Uruguay round that created the WTO. The history books are going to record that this was an extraordinary organization that for about 25 years provided a fair degree of stability to the rules of global trade. That is unraveling in various ways now, and there would be big stories in terms of to what extent can the WTO be stitched back together. I think the Biden administration will want to engage with Europe and with other countries on this, and some things to look for. Does the U.S. lift the hold on new appointments to the appellate body, which is the WTO's highest court? And does the U.S. change course with respect to who's going to be the WTO's next director general? Nigerian American Ngozi is the consensus candidate, but the U.S., for bizarre reasons, is blocking her candidacy. That could change under a Biden administration. I think this is a particularly interesting story for reporters working in smaller economies. The WTO is a great thing for smaller economies that don't have the kind of economic muscle that a U.S. or the European Union or China has. And so for those countries, the future of the WTO is incredibly important. So kind of the usual suspects here, though again, I found historically Geneva representatives for all these countries a great potential source for you. Closer to home here in North America, I would watch really carefully what happens with the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement and labor. The biggest change between the new USMCA and the old NAFTA is the labor enforcement provisions, and a lot of this was at the insistence of House Democrats, are the most robust we've ever seen in a trade agreement. It includes what's known as a rapid response mechanism. So if the U.S. believes that a particular company is failing to allow union organizing in its plant, there's a provision for a quick complaint, a quick investigation, and potentially targeted tariffs on the exports from that specific plant. That's a far more aggressive procedure than we have ever seen in a trade agreement before. And the Biden administration, I suspect, will be under early pressure from the AFL-CIO and other labor union officials. Be a great source on this story to make good on the promise to enforce this aggressively. So I think this is going to be a big issue between the United States and Mexico, one that's likely, I think, to raise some tensions pretty quickly. So that's one I'd watch. And then just one last one, a sort of neat half dozen. What are we going to do with respect to Europe? I think Mary's right. The biggest, I think, philosophical difference between the Trump administration and what we will see in a Biden administration is Biden is very pro-alliance. And for the United States, that means being pro-Europe. Donald Trump hammered the Europeans very hard over NATO. And if you look on the trade front, the Europeans were on the receiving end of the steel and aluminum tariffs and a series of threats by President Trump to put tariffs on European auto exports. Biden will try to make up with the Europeans. I don't think there's any question, but there are some big issues out there. I mean, Airbus and Boeing, a sort of 20-year-old dispute. It's actually really a 40-year-old dispute. I started covering it in 1992, and it predated even that. But we now have billions of dollars in tariffs in place on both sides. It affects a lot of industries, not just aircraft sales. There's a great piece, Bloomberg this morning, about Delta trying to circumvent the tariffs on Airbus aircraft coming into the U.S. But if you've got alcoholic beverage distillers in any of your districts. They've all been whacked by this. Brexit's got a whole set of complications. The Biden administration much less supportive than the Trump administration was. And then Mary flagged this one, but there's a big fight looming with the French in particular over taxation of digital companies. The Europeans feel like the American digital giants are getting away scot-free in terms of paying taxes in Europe. So it's a big issue both for US-Europe relations and for the specific tech companies. I apologize for the typo there, European diplomats in Washington. I will fix that. But again, kind of the usual sources, but Europeans in Washington are great. The lovely thing about the Europeans in Washington is you have member state representatives, British, French, German. You also have the European Union. And you can often get them both to talk. And sometimes they don't say the same things, which is great because then you can go back and forth and say, what's actually going on here? And there are also some think tanks that are very good on Europe. The German Marshall Fund, the Atlantic Council, the AICGS, the American Council on Germany, based in New York, Chatham House in London, ACP in Brussels. So there's a broader range of think tanks that you can go to for those stories. So I will stop it there. We are all on Twitter, by the way, which is a great way to follow some of these trade debates. So thank you very much, Sunny. I will stop the share and turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in by email, chat, and people raising their hands. Before we turn to, and I promise we will get to all of you eventually, but before we turn to Ling Ling for the view on China and how this is all being seen from Beijing's point of view, and also to what extent what's going on with U.S. companies. Ted mentioned some. I just want to turn it over for a moment to some questions about the domestic situation. We have David Murray from Waterways Journal and High Plains Journal, a senior writer. David, Tyler, can you unmute David to ask his question?
Thank you, and good morning, and thank all of you. My question is about the recent large purchases of agricultural products by China, and whether, in the panel's opinion, this has any phase one or the response to internal demands coming from within China, like the rebuilding of their hog herd and so on.
Ling Ling, do you want to tackle that one, or you want to pass?
Sure. Obviously, Ted and Mary, feel free to add any, points to the question. Thank you, David. I think, it's because of both. Definitely internally in China, the demand for hogs are, rising as well. And obviously, China still has the intention to implement the phase one trade agreement. One of the, as we mentioned yesterday when Sunny and all the other panelists were preparing for this seminar today, we basically were talking about, there's still 10 weeks to go, right, before the next administration. And there's still a number of things the Trump administration can do to further worsen the ties between Beijing and Washington. So right now, the leadership in Zhongnanhai in Beijing, the last thing they want to do is to further provoke Trump, right? Cause a complete collapse of the relationship. So in the near term, at least on the Chinese side, they have every intention and desire to keep phase one going.